All right. So today is November 15th, and this is the fourth meeting of the Vermont Agricultural Recovery Task Force. So we have a pretty straightforward agenda today. First off, we wanted to just hold the first 15 minutes or so to allow for updates from anyone if they need to give them. Hi, Ben. So we'll just start with opening up the floor to if anyone has updates from their specific agency or organization, and then we're going to move into report outs from the subgroups on the workbook. Gonna look at Ben because I'm guessing that he might have some updates. Ben, do you have any updates you want to provide? And you can say no on overall recovery efforts for the state, and I can probably give a couple.
Oh gosh.
But I was on vacation,
well,
so I'm just looking at you.
I'm tempted to just say no, but I could also just go on for several hours. So I'll try to find the sweet spot.
Okay.
So I guess I'll start with this. I have to jump off at 9:30 for a conversation with Doug Farnham and some members of his team where we're working on coalescing the legislative package that he is developing to present from the Flood Recovery Office. And so if there are things that we need from the Vermont legislature, it's mid-November, so the sooner the better.
Mhm.
And certainly we have some coming from other aspects of the recovery. I don't have anything agriculture specific at this time, so I guess I won't go into the weeds of the other programs, but recovery is ongoing. Full stop.
Thank you. I guess the one update that I can give, and Roy, chime in if there's other things that you have to add, is that Roy and I have been speaking about kind of what is our ultimate plan with these workbooks and with the priorities that we're going to hear about today. And so what we plan to do is hear from all three subgroups today, and then we are going to get together and work out the outline and ultimately a report out on what our top priorities are for agriculture. And I will then submit that up to Doug. Ben, so you'll probably be hearing more about this than our other interagency recovery group. So that is our plan, is to get that together and have that in by December, early December. So
does that sound like a good timeline, Ben? Because we weren't sure when the others were going to be sending their stuff up, but we wanted to make sure that we were in time before the legislature commences.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the earlier things are ready so that you can start socializing with specific legislators, the better. But I think that's a realistic and reasonable time frame.
Okay.
Anyone else have specific agency or organization updates regarding agriculture recovery?
I can add something quickly. We were really noticing in the Farm and Forest Viability Program that we hardly got any enrollments over the summer. It's normally our slower time, but this was notably slow. And after talking to some people, we're sort of assuming that that's mostly due to emergency response being the focus and a lot of our business planners diverting their attention there. And things really have picked up. And the enrollments are kind of starting to roll in over the fall, and it's been pretty strong. And definitely seeing recovery as a really major theme, whether from flooding or other damage. And it's definitely something that our network is really talking about. Do we need to make any shifts? Put any particular added focus around this? So excited to hear what other groups have come up with.
Thank you. Not to put you on the spot, but Eileen, I saw you just joined. So just so you know, we are just offering any updates related to agriculture recovery that agencies or organizations have. And then we're going to move into the report out from the work groups.
Great. Thanks. Sorry to be late.
Grace.
So,
Julie, do you have an
Nicole, I
update?
was going to mention something.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a side note, but our continuing resolution ends this Friday. So we are kind of struggling with, the farmer needs to kind of implement the programs like NAP and ELAP and the emergency conservation programs with this, looming over our heads. So it's creating a big bungle
Mhm.
for us this fall. And secondly, we also have a recent announcement of a new program called it just went out of my head, ERP 2022, which is kind of a revenue type protection or assessment. The applications went out last week, and if farmers had a claim in 2022 in NAP or in crop insurance, that information already, was entered onto the application to kind of demonstrate how ad hoc recovery programs can be quick to administer if you have a safety net program in place. And this is one program we are hoping to get for 2023. However, again, with the funding and situation in Washington, we don't know when exactly that can happen for 2023. So that's our kind of FSA update.
Okay. All right. Last call for updates. Any other updates?
Abby, Ward.
Yeah, I could just do a quick update on the BGAP program for ag applications. I don't have final numbers just because the program is still processing awards, but there's about 120 applications that have been submitted to the Agency of Commerce for final review and or payment. And those awards within the agricultural sector, again, are going to span somewhere between 1.5 million in awards and 4 million. And it really sort of depends on, there's $20 million total currently for the program, and the payments process is working through based upon submitted by date. So anyway, so the payment process at Commerce is going through application by application, depending upon when they were received to process awards until we reach the $20 million mark. But there were 160 applications or 155 applications received in the agricultural sector. And it looks like 120 of them are recommended for approval at this point, and hopefully majority of those will receive an award payment based upon when they were the applications were submitted by. So no final numbers as of yet, but we're getting much closer.
Do you know what the total amount requested was against the 20 million available?
Of all applications, Ben? Or just ag?
Well, both, I guess, if you know.
Yeah, let's see, can I answer that question? Let me see if I can put it in the chat rather than holding up. I'll look to get that answer and put it in.
And I have a question for Abby too. Are the applications still open or is that closed?
Yeah, good question, Julie. So the applications closed on the 23rd of October. And any submitted applications that were complete at that time were recommended for approval and are in the queue or have already been paid. There were a variety of applications that were still in an incomplete status on the 23rd of October that we went back and forth to attempt to finalize and get to a complete award. And then any of those applications that were not complete by last Monday are unlikely to be considered for an award within the $20 million total amount available. So there's been a lot of leniency and attempts to get as many applications submitted as complete in the system as possible, but also a need to put a final timeline out there, since the program overall will likely exceed the $20 million that's currently appropriated for the program.
Thanks.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Okay. So the bulk of the meeting today is going to be to hear from the subgroups. I would really like to hear about kind of what your conversation was in your subgroup meeting. And then if you're able to share your screen, that would be great. So we can kind of see your workbook and what you've identified as goals and priorities, as well as gaps. Any other things that we want to ask, Roy?
I think that was it. I think that was the main points we wanted to pull out from the working groups.
Okay. Is there a group that would like to start first?
If nobody else minds, I might want to start first, just because my sick kid is currently tolerating me being on this meeting.
Yes, absolutely. Let's go ahead.
Awesome, thank you. Let's see if I can share screen.
And this is farmer empowerment, just so everybody knows. That's where we're starting.
Thank you. Yeah. And for folks who I don't know, I'm Liz Gleason. I'm the Farm and Forest Viability Program Director at the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board. Hold on, it's just going to take me a sec to share my screen. For some reason, I'm not getting the option to share just Excel. Will it work if I do entire screen?
Liz, do you want me to try to do a screen share?
Yeah. Sorry, I always use the browser version, and I know that it's not ideal for Zoom. Abby, do you have that up in front of you?
I had it up. Yeah, let me get it back.
Thanks. Well, maybe while Abby is looking for that, I'll just start by some of the major themes that we identified. So again, this was farmer empowerment, which we interpreted as like the on-the-ground direct work with businesses who'd been impacted, and what sort of supports and services would be most needed to help them move forward. Hold on one sec. Oh. Doing a handoff over here. We had three sort of major themes emerge. We talked a lot about what has been going on. Oh, am I reverberating? Hello? Is that better?
Yes, it stopped.
Great. Okay, we're off to a rocky start here, but let's keep going. Abby, will you scroll down a little bit? Just at the bottom, I listed the sort of three main themes. So we talked a lot about what had gone really well, and we think that there was a lot. There was a really strong, incredibly strong, like mutual aid and farmer to farmer response. There was an incredibly strong sort of service provider network response. And there's obviously like a lot of really committed efforts on all levels of ag, government, state, federal organizations, and we think that's all amazing stuff to work on. Couple of things that we really felt like could have gone better are to think about that immediate and coordinated response. Sorry, Abby, I was just going to quickly talk through those three that were down at the bottom, because there's a lot more details up above. So we had a big theme around like in that immediate, first couple days to first couple months, like what's the best way to communicate information, both in between service providers, in between government. Obviously, we have the statewide recovery task force system, which is great, but it's not necessarily the first thing that kicks in. So what can we do to make sure that as service providers, our efforts are really efficient and effective? And we think that some coordinated effort around that and conversation could help things just go more smoothly next time. Another major priority would be like an extremely concerted effort to reach farmers over the winter. Obviously, folks had a lot of pretty intense immediate need, and we all know that a lot of them will be seeing a longer term effect over the winter, and things will really come into more dire situations. So making sure that people have access to really individualized, immediate support over the winter, and any much more longer term support. And then this last sort of theme obviously crosses all three of the groups, and I'm sure it came up for others, but just heightening that, coordinated communication and ideas around securing funding, policy changes, and other structural supports that will help us. So obvious examples being like immediate grant assistance, whether or not our insurance works well for this kind of thing, and other policy changes. So maybe before I get into any details, Nicole, is there any particular way you were hoping we could share this info that would be most helpful? Any questions from anyone else?
I think just kind of going through the workbook and showing us like what are the priorities, and then also like if you've identified any gaps or communications that need to happen. But mostly looking at Roy, I don't know if there's a best way that you would like it to be communicated.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, I think you covered much of it in summary, but I wanted to kind of see the workbook, and it's there on the screen right now, which is so helpful.
I think this document is going to be really helpful for us in creating the report and writing the report. But for me, I know that this is just kind of like the notes. So it'll be helpful for me to hear you kind of like flesh it out a little bit so I can look back and be like, oh, this is what they meant.
Sure. Great. Well, we did feel like we had to do some slight interpretation of some of these. So if there's anything here that didn't meet what you were looking for, let me know, and I'm happy to talk through any of this. So the short-term priorities we sort of defined as like what really needs to happen over the next couple months that's critical over the winter, basically. People have really loved the sort of farmer to farmer info sharing, things like the hay exchange that the agency is running. And this isn't happening right now, but during COVID, like NOFA's relief milker program, people have found those effective. And making sure we sort of compile and document all those things that are working such that if there's a next one of these, they can be immediately rolled out. We also talked about potentially doing some kind of farmer follow-up survey to get some more detailed info on what people felt like worked really well and what didn't work really well in the immediate aftermath. We didn't talk a lot about exactly how that would look or how many people would need to be reached and the fact that people are over surveyed. But we did feel like it was important to figure out a way to get some feedback while it's still semi-fresh in people's minds. We talked about making sure that Vermont is best drawing down all the IRA climate money that's coming. And I know a lot of people are thinking about that in lots of different ways. But I do believe it's particularly relevant to this group. And then just like having a really coordinated and intentional outreach to farmers over the winter, which is something that Farm Viability could do, that lots of other folks could do in coordination to make sure people know about all the mental health resources, business planning, technical support, all that stuff. And this is sort of an obvious, and I know it's already happening, which is legislative agenda. Is that sort of in line with what you're thinking for short-term priorities? Does that all make sense?
It makes sense to me. I actually quite, I mean, what I find interesting is the gaps that you identified here. And you've kind of broadened some of the perspectives in terms of what the gaps look like. For example, where you say that emergency loans as the main federal disaster recovery tool is dangerous is a very interesting way to look at this, because a number of people have asked for emergency loans as a quick way of dealing with the immediate aftermath of disaster. So these are very interesting perspectives, and in a way provides what I feel will be a good gap analysis portion of the report that we'll eventually put there, because these are important thoughts here, particularly for the gap.
Well, why don't we switch over? I can talk through some of these gaps, and these are not exhaustive. I'm sure other people here could think of gaps in our gaps, and some of these short-term and long-term priorities and communication needs are in and of themselves gaps. So we felt like there was a lot of flow between all the categories. But just building on that, Roy, I think we all know that there's lots of great reasons why emergency disaster loans are the main sort of federal tool. It's not like there's endless quantities of easy money out there for this kind of thing. I will say that it can feel like a real sort of onslaught of communication, that like, you have to go through a pretty intensive sort of documentation process that may very well not lead anywhere, and the only sure place that it might lead is a loan when you have just lost a massive amount of money. And not that loans aren't an important tool in a toolbox, but as a main tool, they can feel dangerous to have that be the main tool. And what the sort of policy implications of that are, it's not my area of expertise. We all know this. Abby, you just talked about this with BGAP, you know, scale of loss to scale of funding. There's a big gap. I know there's people that are interested in continuing to work to fill that gap, whether or not that's, you know, the purview of this group, I'm not sure. But we do know that there's still a massive loss happening across all sectors. We talked a lot about how that sort of stacking of like NOFA emergency funds, Vermont Community Foundation, then BGAP, like they all played a really important role. And in those early days, it was really, really critical to have like that very, very flexible NOFA set of funding. So mostly just wanted to highlight that was really important. And if that didn't exist next time, that would be a gap. And I think a lot of us felt like everyone did so much and worked really hard in the immediate aftermath, and moving from that immediate emergency response now into this more longer term, it feels like potentially there's a little bit of a feeling of a lost momentum. So how can we come back together? And that's not a reflection on this group at all, more like thinking more broadly about all of our work in our own organizations. Abby, anything I'm missing about the gaps conversation that we had, or things that you think we should pull over from other columns to talk about in gaps?
Nothing that's missing from gaps. I think you did a really nice job, Liz, talking about that. Is anything here on the communication needs that feels worthy of, that you didn't yet cover?
Yeah, we talked a bit about this idea of some kind of like emergency communication hub. And this again is all in the context of like, we know that the state has this organized system that we are in right now. But for those really early days, like everybody who touched farmers at all was like just full on like feeling like they needed to know every single thing that was happening. And it didn't necessarily feel like the most effective use of our collective time. So maybe a small committee or some kind of subgroup could explore the feasibility of like, is there a slightly different approach that we want to take, such that, you know, when the next time comes around, we have those like early days people who are like, you know, it's my job to just focus on this. I'll help compile resources. I'll make sure there's not, you know, 8,000 different lists of the things that you should do. And people, you know, leaving farmers to feel like, am I actually doing the right things? And this isn't meant to be a reflection on, I think we all agreed that we felt like collectively we did a pretty good job under the circumstances, but interested in refining that, because sadly we know there'll be a next time. We did feel like a lot went well, and I don't know that I need to go through this whole list in column D, we sort of interpreted the progress as things that we wanted to lift up as really effective. I can go through that if folks want. I don't want to take up too much time if we're trying to move on to others, but I don't want to shortchange all the work that our group did either. Any questions, thoughts, concerns?
Some very interesting thoughts on this in the workbook here. I'm going to take some time to go through it because I find the perspectives very interesting. And there is a hand raised, Marley.
Hi, folks. I just wanted to comment on one point that you had in there, and Abby's gone past it, so I hope I can remember what it said. But it was basically recognizing that it isn't just about the struggles that farmers have gone through. It's also about what farms have contributed in terms of resilience and benefits to the community by having floodplain land where floods can go. And I think that's a really important point, not just for us to publicize, because frankly, that's been part of another group's discussion too, the regulatory group, about recognizing how much farmers did during the summer to contain all that stormwater in manure pits in some cases, and the challenges that result from that. But also, I'm wondering, especially Liz, to you from the farm and forest viability point of view, is there an opportunity here for talking with farmers about where there are increased chances for flood resilience benefits? When can we have those conversations about that field has flooded 8 times in the last 10 years? Let's talk about how we can compensate you in a different way for using that land differently, if that makes sense.
That did come up really specifically. Thank you, Marley. That's in our long-term goal. We know there's a lot of conversation in the conservation world about floodplain resilience, and there's a lot of conversation in the farm world about recovery, and they're like so interconnected. And a piece of that is making sure that people really know about the funding sources that are available. If folks wanted to do more conservation projects, more buffers, take land out of production, work on wetland stuff. So that's sort of in those two next to each other. Thank you.
Yeah,
Abby.
because we're in a sweet spot now of that opportunity to have these conversations with farmers while it's all fresh in our minds, and it'd be an interesting conversation to have sooner rather than later.
Yeah, I'd love to think about what that could look like, and how to do better communication around that. And that I think goes along in those short-term priorities about what is a really sort of coordinated like outreach effort around, here are the options for long-term recovery. Let's make sure everyone knows about them. And we're using all communication channels and all service providers to make sure we're really collecting the opportunities effectively and stewarding people through that. And yeah, that was a really specific communication piece too, in terms of like public messaging. It definitely came up, that sort of tension between when we're talking about floodplains, farms are really important part of what makes the state more resilient, but it also puts them more on the front lines of sort of facing the dangers of flooding.
And as everyone on this call knows, we're in an unprecedented amount of funding right now with the NRCS IRA money, with extra, another $20 million of RCPP funds that have just come into the state in the last, or been awarded in the last couple of weeks. So a real opportunity for some targeted work. So look forward to those conversations.
Yeah, Marley, and this is pretty specific, and maybe it needs a follow-up conversation between you and I, but like I'm really curious to understand more how we can get people in the door effectively for that. I know we have a lot of amazing NRCS and conservation district staff who are working so hard on that, but it's a super big lift.
All right, it looks like Julie has her hand up, and then we will move on to the government systems group.
Thanks. I just wanted, could you kind of revisit your gap point about the emergency loans being dangerous, and I don't want to make assumptions of what dangerous means, and kind of under the perception of under farmer empowerment. Could you speak to that a little bit
Yeah.
more or again?
Sure. Yeah. And I think we sort of intentionally used a slightly provocative word there. They're both important and dangerous, I think. I think that the challenge that a lot of us who are like deep in the finances of the businesses we're seeing is just like on the heels of such intense loss to think about like, how can I float another loan when I might be like highly leveraged and not sure yet if I can replant and like, have no idea what next year looks like. It can be very risky. Becoming sort of over leveraged in that moment. And not that I think lenders are like out there just like making bad decisions. I don't mean to imply that. I think the main point here is having emergency loans as like the primary thing that gets communicated about, like, this is the only thing we think that might be available. It's really tough. And it wasn't seeking to like cast blame, but more to say like, if we're talking about needs, it's cash that's not a loan. It's the highest,
Right.
most desirable thing.
Sure. Right. So thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah. And I don't think anyone was suggesting that they go away or like it's bad to have emergency loans. I think it's more like that as the sort of single most viable opportunity from a federal perspective.
It's interesting. I'll hold my other thoughts for when we go to our section. But thanks.
All right, so we can move on now. Thank you very much. And I just put in the chat too, if all the groups could send your completed workbooks to Roy and I, that would be great. Steve, are you leading us off on government systems?
I hope not. No, I think I am. And my notes were jotted at 6 a.m. this morning, so they're not very easy or ready for screen share, but I will supplement that. But the good news is our group grew tired of bureaucratic indecision, so we just fixed it. And so we're all set. Everything's good now.
Remember, this is recorded, so I'll remember this.
I'm going to look to our group to help me and fill in the gaps, but I'll try to lead sort of the themes that I think we went over. Essentially, we talked, like probably everyone, about what went well and what didn't go well, and focused in on what needs to change or what ideally needs to change. I think, and this may not be the group's feeling, but for me personally, the biggest sort of aha moment to me is the fact that farmers who grow our food and crops and do so outside where they're prone to both disaster and to other detrimental impacts. They're growing them in a risky environment, often in floodplains, which happen to be often an ideal use of those floodplains, not, as Marley referenced, not always, but many times it's the best place to grow our food. But the damage is absolutely predictable and foreseeable, not when, but it's going to happen. And normally in our society, I feel like we sort of have some risk management programs that are set up to address that. If a farm's barn burns down, they're very likely to have insurance that will come at least close to making them whole. But with our food and crops, the system, at least in my fairly uneducated view, is wholly inadequate. Even if farmers do everything right, they're likely to suffer real and substantial losses. And most farmers don't do everything right. And why that is an interesting question, and that deserves a lot of exploration. But only, as I understand it, and FSA folks, please correct me if I'm wrong, only a few of the major crops are covered by the federal private insurance program. So wheat, soybeans, corn, think maybe apples. So for those crops, you can buy insurance of up to 90% of your losses. So that may be reasonable to do that. It may not be affordable, I don't know, but at least it may be reasonable. But for all other crops that don't fit within that program, NAP is the program that's left to cover those losses. NAP, the most you can buy up, I think the baseline coverage is 50% of your losses, and the most you can buy up to is 65%. So from a starting point, for most farmers in Vermont, at least those who grow our food, they are going to lose probably 50% or at least up to 35% of their crops, even if they enroll and get coverage. And what we know is almost none of them do. So right now, I feel like our farmers are just set up to fail. And I don't know exactly, even when they do things right, and most of them aren't doing things right. So, I mean, when that's a question, I guess a legitimate question is it right to buy insurance that doesn't really compensate your losses adequately? And that's another piece of the NAP program, is that it covers for people who are smaller producers and who sell direct, especially to sell direct to the consumers or have high value products. The NAP coverage doesn't come close to meeting the actual value of the crop. So it just seems like this is a fundamental deficit, and whether that should be covered through better private insurance or whether it should be covered through public programs, I don't know. But as we face trying to better protect ourselves from climate resiliency, as we face probably many more natural disasters, and when we have some of our most valuable land for growing food and crops in floodplains, to not have a built-in system that actually makes farmers whole just seems sort of absurd. And that doesn't mean that there aren't people working tirelessly to fill in the gaps, including the federal government and USDA when they come up with extra programs and extra relief. But to not have that certainty, that system, it makes it very difficult. And it's very hard, I think, to get farmers to enroll in a system that doesn't really meet the needs. So this is a huge, from my perspective at least, it's a huge problem, not an easy one to fix because it's federal. But I suspect that there is significant impetus around the country to address some of these issues. And we actually raised this with NASDA, which is the National Association of State Department of Agriculture, in August as an action item. Secretary Tebbets did that, and it was approved as an action item to work on. But that just seems like a threshold issue that if we really want to deal with natural disasters and we want to deal with our food production and our food and crop production, that we need to somehow be prepared to address the inevitable losses that come with natural disasters. So that's kind of the big one for me, at least. But then other things we talked about were better utilizing what we have. So many of our programs, like the livestock indemnity, well, the federal government's programs, but the livestock indemnity program, the ELAP program, they seem to work quite well. Even the NAP program can work well for some when they're enrolled, but as we know, there's a real deficit in enrollment. But the things that we can do now are better educate people, get people who can benefit from those programs into them. And then I think the sidelight to that is we also want to create better options, for more long-term options that will work better for everyone. One thing that I think it was John Roberts brought up was that and this kind of came up in the earlier conversation too, but is better informing farmers prior to the emergency. And, for VT alerts and the governor and many people were definitely getting the word out. It's people knew about this flood. But that said, there were farms whose tractors were destroyed, farmers' tractors and other equipment where I don't know why we don't have that sort of level of detail, but somehow to get more specific notice to the farmers who are more at risk to minimize and mitigate the losses as much as possible. That might be through, our secretary is wonderful on social media. Maybe, and maybe he did put things out, I don't know, but maybe we could better target the audience a little bit to folks who are at highest risk to sort of prevent some of those losses that could have been, if the tractors were moved to high ground, they wouldn't have been destroyed. And, I don't know whether those farmers knew or didn't know, but it just trying to maybe better target our information, and maybe the Agency of Ag can help in that realm in whatever ways, through our distribution list or something, but getting more detailed information out to those most at risk. Another just kind of broad topic was trying to identify the key risks that natural disasters cause, and then evaluating the adequacy of all of the existing programs. So that kind of goes hand in hand with what we were talking about with the crop insurance, but really there's kind of a finite number of things on a farm that can be harmed by a disaster, and looking at each of those and evaluating how well we can respond to them through existing resources before we have to tap into philanthropy or other programs or things like BGAP that don't already exist. Like, what do we have in place to address these things that we know are coming? Another thing we talked about is, our USDA and FSA and our NRCS folks have really been working incredibly hard to help all of the farmers and to address their needs. But during that emergency response, there's just not enough personnel to help. And so we talked about, FEMA is pretty great at coming out. They send the Small Business Administration, they send all these resources, they sit in town halls and they take applications and they talk to people. Where we discuss, why not USDA as well? Why doesn't USDA part of that relief that's sent out in the field to respond to emergencies? We could perhaps get more people out on the farms, even talking to people directly, helping them address the issues, maybe even deputizing, for lack of a better word, folks in the state agencies to go out and help. Maybe there's some people in state agencies who are trained to help with federal flood response, so that they can actually be on the field answering questions quickly and immediately, because there's just too much volume for existing staff to handle. So trying to flesh out how to better position USDA and the state to be able to help with that response. And then finally, just the typical navigating the typical bureaucratic process. It's never easy to make claims. It's never easy to distribute taxpayer money. There have to be checks on it. There need to be some assurances that it's being appropriately spent. But anything that we can do to help with the recovery process using technology, whether it's people in the field, however it is, to simplify as much as possible so that the government is getting the information it needs to be able to make grants, but also making it as user-friendly as possible, maybe more technical assistance, whatever it takes, so that people who are in the throes of a disaster have at least the education and the knowledge to know what they have to do. And the government, I think the federal government does a great job in so many levels in that way, especially with the FEMA response and being out at town halls and talking to people and having those disaster relief centers set up. But farmers are maybe not as likely to use those resources, and at least for the USDA component, that wasn't part of that setup. So I think that's about all I recall from our conversation. I don't know if other people want to correct me or help me out.
Any other responses from the government systems group? And then we can take some questions before we move into regulatory recovery.
I'll just say, great job, Steve, recapping all of that. Excellent. And why I kind of asked Liz about that, the wording there, is from the perspective of messaging. And, we're kind of in the throes of enrollment of risk management products right now, the fall through spring, and working with RMA, and the Agency of Ag and Extension, and figuring out the best messaging with what we have in our shop right now. And so that's kind of where I thought it's interesting that, I get it under disaster, our messaging is emergency loans. However, instead of, a risk management product. So that's really where I was kind of looking and interested in that perspective.
Yeah, thanks, Julian. I mean, it really is kind of mind-boggling to me that there isn't something that's set up. I mean, insurance, which I know the federal programs are not insurance, but it's designed to make people whole after they suffer losses, and the current systems for disaster crop relief are not. And maybe that's intentional, maybe it's an oversight. I don't know, but it seems like farmers should at least have the option to be able to recover their losses reasonably if they want to. And right now, for a lot of them, they don't.
And I'm glad that it's been brought up, through NASDA and through our congressionals. And I'm really personally looking forward to the Farm Bill where we know this, it's under our safety net division. We know that's really going to come under heavy workload to kind of figure out the best way to move forward in the safety net products that we offer through RMA and FSA. So the Farm Bill is really key to help us move that. So suggestions to, being put forth now are certainly being accumulated to work on when we get there. So, thanks.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Anyone else from our group want to chime in? If you start with, I did a great job, that's helpful.
Marley.
Actually, I think Nina had her hand up first.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry. Steve, you did a great job.
Thanks. I just had a quick comment to add, which is, I think something that we haven't quite done yet is try to get a report, and someone mentioned this in our last meeting, I believe, on, federal program, disaster program enrollment and reach. So what farmers, based on what we understand to be those who've experienced damage and loss, have been able to successfully access and utilize federal programs. And I'm just sort of mentioning that as a component of either the report work that we do or just the next step, because I think it's crucial to understanding based on data, like where, how much of a gap is accessing those programs in general. Not like, I think Steve, you did a wonderful job outlining some of the concerns and issues, but right, to what extent are we reaching individuals with the existing suite of government services that are available? I think that's a crucial question.
Agreed. You can criticize what we have, but if you're not using what we have, then that's an even bigger issue, I think.
We do actually have program by program reports that we're sending to the Secretary of Agriculture right now weekly. So again, I think staffing has certainly been a challenge to get everything rolling, but we're kind of working through a lot of that this fall. And the participation, I think we've identified people we really can't serve, the program doesn't fit for them, and the ones that we have been able to serve. So we can certainly put some numbers in the chat or some other way to report them to you. Yeah.
All right, there are two hands raised now, Marley and Eileen.
Eileen, if you wanted to continue on that conversation, feel free to take the talking stick first, because I was going to change the subject a little bit.
Yeah, I'm changing the subject a little bit, but it doesn't matter. Good, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess my comment kind of covers all three of the work groups here. The idea of how to get communication out to farmers as quickly as possible. And Steve, you very well touched on some of this, as have others, including Ben in our meeting. But one of the things that A&R did after Irene, and granted that was a while ago, but it did help us this time, was create kind of an emergency task force of people to find out who has what skills. So when we do have an emergency, who is in our watershed management program, for example, who doesn't work on rivers right now, but knows about rivers and how to work on rivers and can reprioritize and drop everything and focus on that. And I think it would be a valuable use of someone's time, our collective time, to look at the resources that exist between the state agencies, but also in our conservation districts. And just, if nothing else, have a listserv that we can blast out information to everybody quickly in an emergency situation, and find out who does have skills that can be reprioritized. The Dam Safety Task Force put out a massive request right after the flooding saying we need people to make phone calls to everyone who owns a dam in the state and talk to them about this. A whole bunch of people signed up in A&R quickly to help make phone calls. We had a script, did it. So just developing those kinds of processes, I think would be helpful across all of this.
So Marley, that's a great point. Before we move on to Eileen, I don't know if you're aware of the Cells to Society monthly forum that Extension has. One of the things that is a kind of meeting of the minds around interesting issues. And every few months or so, the group comes back with what's called an out of the box kind of think tank session. On the last session, I invited Nicole to join us, and this is exactly what we talked about. We kind of looked internally at Extension, see how we can actually do better next time around, how we can better prepare ourselves, and how we look at the resources. But how do we make information accessible very, very quickly to farmers and others? And so we're looking at whether this should be a particular website, where everything is kind of brought together, or an app. That's one of the things I suggested. I don't know, but something that's mobile that farmers can see in real time, really quickly. And I have a couple of pages of documents of a document that was prepared as notes, which I won't share right now, but I'm going to provide it and make it available at some point for all to see as soon as they kind of refine it. But that's exactly what we talked about, because we realize the urgency of all of that. And certainly we talked about also a number of the bureaucratic issues that Steve talked about. I have questions too, but in the interest of time, I'll move on to Eileen.
Yeah, just a couple of quick things. I think primarily one of the things that I'm not even sure we talked about it in our subgroup, Steve, is FSA got thrown into the role of the state data collector. It's not a role that's well suited to our county office staff. So for the next time, I think it would be a worthwhile task to figure out who has the resources to actually collect all this data and synthesize it and redistribute it so that we can respond better. Because it's not FSA. I don't want to throw my staff under the bus, but it's not what we do. But somehow we got anointed to collect all the data. And then my other, just a brief comment, Julie said we have a spreadsheet that has some numbers. It's only the FSA programs. We don't have any of NRCS's numbers, and a bunch of them are out in a leadership meeting. Are they on this task force, NRCS folks? Travis must be. Yeah. So,
Yeah, Travis is out today, but yes, he is.
That would be, I'm sure, beneficial for folks to see. Because they've, obviously they can respond faster than FSA, their types of programs, their types of funding. So they've definitely got more money out than we do. But it's a joint effort.
Eileen, just quickly, what kind of data do you mean? Is it for the program request or something different?
Everything, because when the disaster hit, somehow the messaging was call FSA to report your damage. And my staff got, they're sitting there at their desks with an already overwhelming workload, starting to take calls that don't really have anything to do with our programs, which, we were happy to help. But again, our strength is not in collecting and disseminating data. And we didn't have any good way. It was a spreadsheet. Somebody's department out there must have a better way to collect data than a spreadsheet that sits where no one else can see it.
Yeah. Okay. So you were getting a lot of calls for services you don't provide, but you were gathering that information. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. A lot of it is services that we could try to provide, but again, it was the fact that every agricultural producer in the state was told, report your damages to FSA.
Yeah.
And we didn't have a way to respond to a lot of them.
But I think I believe we're the only agency or service provider with presence in every single county.
That's true.
So that was, I think, where that kind of came from. But yes, it was a lot for our limited staff, but
I mean, maybe we could be the data collector, but we just need somebody with a little bit more data collection and analysis experience to maybe make us a template.
Or maybe if USDA was sending people with the FEMA recovery, you know, maybe that could be part of that role too. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
That had to be overwhelming.
There's still one hand raised. I believe it's Liz.
Yeah, thank you. Eileen, I'm so curious about what you just said, and I feel bad that I haven't heard that framed in that way before. I was under the impression that it was like a good and very important thing that everyone call FSA because that was going to be like the only way we could effectively get a federal disaster declaration. Am I like totally wrong there? Because yeah, it seemed like that was such a massive lift and not your normal day to day.
Yeah. So, yes, it's necessary for us to request some programs like our emergency conservation program. We need to hear from producers about how much damage they have so we know how much we're asking for. It's kind of a no-brainer with a disaster of this magnitude that we should be asking for ECP, and there were other parts of our process that moved way too slowly, so we're working on that end of things to get the ECP program implemented, to get the EFRP program implemented. But, you know, some of those calls absolutely should be coming to FSA because they're programs that we have that we should try to roll out. The other huge misconception, and I think this is mostly a media thing, is there's a secretarial disaster declaration, right? And everybody gets all in a twist about, oh my God, why don't we have the secretarial disaster declaration yet? You know what it gets you? Emergency loans, nothing else. So,
Yeah,
you know, the media gets all excited because it's a big word and it doesn't really do anything on the FSA program side of things, nor does it do anything on the NRCS side of things. All it authorizes is emergency loans.
Yeah, there was a lot of angst, I think, about that situation. And it's really helpful to hear what it felt like from the FSA side, because like Marley and Grace just put in the chat, that felt like really intense pressure. And at least for our network of business planning folks, it felt so tricky to be like, you must do this thing. It takes time. But it's like the only option, and yet we might not get anything because of it. And I'd be really excited about an ongoing conversation about what that looks like next time.
But that did trigger the president, you know, the other part of that is not the secretarial, is to trigger FEMA. So
no, the
some of that tied in
FEMA.
with FEMA, right? So the secretarial, presidential, that whole disaster declaration deal, right, is intertwined for, and maybe we're not, we all know it's important, but we don't really know. Like you said, what does it get? It gets FEMA and emergency loans, right? Mm-hmm. But we do need it also for the emergency conservation, which we need information. It helps us support the information to get the emergency conservation suite. Those are not automatic, open enrollment like ELAP or something else. So,
right.
So we did need the information. I think, it was, that's definitely a gap that I'd identify as how do we get that information accumulation buttoned up, right, and better. I like the app idea that Roy had, and USDA does have this disaster kind of questionnaire online. I think Travis had mentioned it. It's to me, it's not quite, it's specific to USDA, but it maybe doesn't always fit our region's needs to understand what the federal program is. So.
All right, in the interest of time, we should go to Abby and then into her final report, working group report.
Yes.
Did I preempt you, Nicole?
Yes, you did. Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I can be really brief. I was just feeling moved to speak on this piece just because the agency was one of the major messaging engines that said report your damage to FSA. And I think, to me, this is an example of what we learned during this emergency and then this disaster, that I think I will speak for myself. I understood that emergency loans were all that was guaranteed, but I had hoped that something more might happen as a result of having that aggregate data, cataloged in one location. And in hindsight, recognize that stress and pressure on FSA offices was even probably more detrimental and deterred time and energy away from processing actual applications than just collecting data. So it feels to me like this just somehow goes in the bucket of a learned lesson and, something that we maybe didn't quite anticipate would occur or would be the only limited outcome of that kind of aggregate reporting. So, Leanne, I too appreciate you sharing it. I hadn't heard that sentiment before, but it perfectly makes sense. And yeah, let's do it differently next time.
Thank you. All right. Is it Nina? Are you taking us into regulatory recovery, or is somebody else taking the lead?
Yep.
Thank you.
Just a sec. While I pull this up, yeah, definitely agree with the sentiments discussed. And I think the other component was like a pretty limited understanding of the disaster assistance programs at FSA. So we were really just pushing people there because none of us understood the deep intimacy, nuance, like how those programs would function and what they would cover. So, now that we've compiled substantial resources on that, it'll be key to inform like how we do data collection next time, which is hard to say, but understandable. So I'm a visual person and I can't look at spreadsheets and retain information. So I popped this into a PowerPoint last night. I think before I jump into like what we discussed, one, I'll just say anyone who is part of that conversation, please feel free to add any context that I might miss. I think the themes of what we talked about are really around, regulations involved in blood recovery, both like how to make sure we have food system resilience, but not just food system resilience, also like land resilience and community resilience. And really, I think some of this can fall into the category of gaps and things done well, and some of it can fall into categories of like ongoing needs, but primarily like what are the relevant regulations? Who do you go to for assistance? Like who's the primary? And then how do we support farms to repair and move forward effectively without, sacrificing economic viability or causing further economic, social, or environmental damage. So that was sort of the tune of our conversation. We had a good crew who participated and a couple folks who provided some information via email. Our task was to identify, ability to maintain or defer regulatory compliance. So I'm going to go through the issues and just describe them, and then there's a handful of stuff related to them that I think falls in a wide spectrum on your template, Nicole, for the workbook that I can send you guys. But primarily the post, immediate response after the flood, the issues we were dealing with more so than anything else was dairy storage. So there's like a 72-hour rule for dairy processing facilities. The Agency of Ag was able to like work with processors and understand the extent of the issue and then file for an extension with FDA. And then also develop a process for processors to request an extension to the 72-hour rule. Then the staff were working directly with processors to basically identify key transportation routes and get those over to the SEOC to get them opened, as well as like driving routes for co-ops and processors so that they didn't end up on unmarked road closures, further kind of impacting this issue. And the other piece of this was like, the concern about milk dumping on farms. And I think one of the biggest ongoing pieces is that, the more funding that we can support for storage on farm, the less we can end up in the situation where milk dumping is the immediate kind of issue. So there's like DBIC funding and some other funding that's been allocated in the past couple of years to support that. And that's really just like enhancing food system resilience when natural disasters happen and our roads are closed and these processes can't continue for food production. And we also developed some guidance around like water quality regulations that came into play with milk dumping. So this was a big one in the short term of the flood. Obviously, the next big one was produce safety, and I'll caveat that we didn't really have the representatives from our produce team in this call, and they should probably review this and finalize anything that we distribute. So Tucker is the lead here, and I haven't had a chance to connect with him, so I apologize for that. But generally, this was the other sort of major big issue that our agency was managing regulatorily post-flood, and everyone did a really awesome job getting information out to the produce community. And holding information sessions for folks to ask questions. There was also efforts to support soil testing. Folks talked about the insurance issues. I think that's still in this space a really big gap. The other gaps that were discussed were like, limited baseline for floodplain soil contamination, as well as sort of, and this has come up in the past too, like messaging and support for produce that is safe after a flood, because I think all the messaging was like directed to produce growers around what to be aware of and didn't really consider the public perception coming from that piece. Waste storage capacity. This is, I would say, where one of the issues we're very actively working on right now. So both fields flooding, consistently wet conditions through the season, has made it so that farms have not been able to basically apply a large amount of their manure from this past season that would have otherwise already been land applied at this point in time. So the biggest concern is going into winter season with really full manure pits. So there is a lot going on in this space actively right now in terms of coordinating with NRCS related to 590 and DEC related to point source regulations. Ongoing things, farms should continue to invest in backup options, plans B and plan C's for when custom operators are in this kind of situation where they haven't been able to spread manure for a large part of the season. One of the big gaps that came up in this discussion was the concept that we are capturing stormwater in production areas, and that when we have these increased rainfall events, farms are then left to store all of that stormwater. So this is a really good opportunity for us to revisit what we're asking farms to do that may then further issues in these kinds of situations. There is messaging going out to sort of ask farms to come to us proactively to talk about their issues so we can try to develop some solutions. We are working through exactly what this is going to look like. In general, there is going to be some sort of process for emergency exemptions when farms have full manure pits this winter. And that process is very much underway with a variety of stakeholders. The other piece that did come up was, this is an ongoing issue. It's outside of flood recovery. It's in general, but just engineering capacity, housing, workforce development issues in that space. So that's an ongoing kind of gap that continues to influence both the post-flood recovery and just the general engineering capacity related to waste storage on farms. The other two sort of big areas of regulatory stuff that we discussed were around basically floodplain impacts. So both farm field repair and farm infrastructure repair. So the primary sort of concerns here really are just that, the floodplain regulations are not something that a farm typically interacts with unless they need to. So the flood sort of like it pushed people into a space that they don't have a lot of experience in, as well as like while they're trying to access disaster assistance funds, like they need to make sure to do that within regulations. So primarily flood hazard, river corridor, and stream alteration rules. And they're typically sort of designed around development purposes. So they're not super well understood in the agricultural community. We talked about the benefits of investment in river corridor easements for long-term environmental benefits. We talked about addressing stream bank erosion. We talked a lot about the education between farmers and river management engineers, just to make sure that they know where to go to ask what they can and can't do. And then just the differentiation of like, it depends if you're talking about debris removal, sediment removal, stream stabilization, it depends where in the field that exactly is happening, to understand what regulations might apply and how you can do it effectively without violating the law. And then the other piece of that was farm infrastructure repair. So, I think this was the piece where we identified there was not a lot of federal disaster assistance outside of disaster emergency loans. So, and the caveat to that is like the farm field repair, there is programming through FSA to support that, but farm infrastructure repair, such as culverts and access roads, was a gap and continues to be a gap in that there really isn't funding directly available for that. I'm not sure, Abby, how much farms reported information in that space in the BGAP program in order to recoup funds for like repairing farm infrastructure related to floods. But we also did talk about the sort of identifying a priority to repair existing clean water practices that have been recently installed. And then again, just like that need to educate and ensure coordination between farms and river management engineers. Culverts obviously are a big piece of this as well. And then Jill wasn't able to join us when we had this discussion, but she sort of sent an email, and I just wanted to capture like the big question that I think we have. I don't know if we have a ton of answers right now, but I think the question that we have is like, and Liz had alluded to this earlier, like the speed at which businesses need to make decisions and to move forward is much faster than government can often operate at. So can there be waivers, permits, forgiveness on compliance with the rules if they're trying to make a decision and move things forward and basically let their business survive and continue their work for the season, if there is a season left? We just need to be very conscious that they are going to do that. And we have a lot of regulations that are, potentially a barrier to that happening, whether it's, the opportunity to improve understanding of those regulations and make it smoother. But that was the tune of what we discussed. I'd invite Marley or Nicole to add if I missed any of the sort of primary topics.
I had a feeling before you started that you were going to have a PowerPoint, but I think you captured it. Great, Nina.
Yeah, Nina, that was hugely comprehensive. That was great. I just wanted to add something to the last point. I think it would be valuable for the agencies to have some discussions about Jill's comment. Obviously, there are rules, there are regulations. We have to meet them. But there is flexibility within state agencies in regulations. There's a term of art that I cannot remember for it right now, but basically just recognizing that in some cases, things need to be a little bit flexible. And while I'm not at all involved in enforcement, there was at least one instance I knew of where there was some flexibility. It's like, look, you can't do this, so fix it. And I'm giving you 4 months or whatever to fix it. It wasn't you got to do this today or there's a $10,000 fine. And I think we all can support each other in that a little bit by encouraging the proactive approach that Nina also mentioned. Farmers don't like going to A&R, and I get that. We're the bad guys, we give fines. We don't always give fines. That's not the goal of anyone in A&R to get money out of a farmer. It's to fix the situation that ended up being wrong. And any proactive approach gives great brownie points to avoiding that fine in the future. If someone comes to A&R and says, I got a problem, or comes to A&R, especially the river engineers, and says, this is the situation here, can you help me? Because there are the enforcement folks who penalize, they go out and say, you screwed up and this is, what the penalty is. But there also are the technical assistance programs, like the Rivers Management Program, and they want folks to call them and say, can you help me do this right? So all of us trying to put a positive spin on regulatory agencies who tend to have negative spins put on them would be really appreciated. Anything all of our partners can do to say, go to A&R, go for assistance ahead of time would help so much.
I think the one thing I'll add to that, Marley, is like, I think there's 4 river management engineers across the state. So like, and they're also getting the calls from municipalities and other constituents. So the capacity is, and they did a really awesome job setting up like a web form for contact and a phone call. And I think they did an incredible job, you know, meeting the demand, but it's just like, are we setting up a resilient process and system by saying the first step is to make a phone call to these people? You know what I mean? And do we have the capacity? And maybe that's what we worry about after we have an effective process for people, you know?
And that goes to the earlier point about having backup people too. There were a lot of people that stepped into river management work in the last few months because they had enough knowledge to be useful.
Yeah, exactly. I guess I'll just invite, before we move on, I'm sure you got other stuff, Nicole, is like, are there regulatory issues that we did not cover that we need to make sure to like ask some more questions and get some more information from folks outside of this group?
Marley, did the idea of waste on farms include produce that was immature before the flood that needed to be disposed of in some way?
I defer to Abby or Nina on that one, from a produce point of view.
Okay.
Roy, is your question, was there something that was missed?
Yeah, I may have said the wrong person. Maybe I was talking to Nina. Did the group look at waste beyond wastewater? Look at produce and other immature fruits or whatever that were on farms that that got damages from the flood.
So
was that included in the waste? I mean, just looking for some clarity on that.
Yeah, we talked about it briefly from my recollection, but I think that that goes back to the point that Nina made on produce, which is that Tucker is our expert within the agency, and so we would need to consult with him to see if he has anything to add to kind of the workbook we put together.
And maybe, Nicole, what I can do is just commit to getting what we've drafted initially as thoughts in this space and give Tucker a little bit of time before I send you guys our final workbooks, if that works, and make sure that we've encompassed the issues that he has been managing in that space.
You should send us the you should send us the PowerPoint too. I like it.
Okay, I'll CC you, Abby, too, if there's anything that you can add in that space as well.
Nina, was there anything in your group's discussion around like organic certification, or I was also thinking about like no-till? I know it's not a regulatory piece, but just acknowledging that there are some folks that are definitely having sediment in their fields that they're going to have to incorporate, and that changes their sort of no-till system. Again, it's not really my area of expertise, but I just didn't know if you guys talked about that at all.
We did not. We did not talk about organic regulations, and that may be a gap that we need to get some information on. And Grace is on, so I might defer, Grace, if you want to summarize and send me an email with things that you'd like us to include as it relates to organic regulations. I'm not an expert in it by any means, so I wouldn't want to misrepresent. And then on, no-till and field management techniques, it all sort of relates. It kind of got encompassed in our conversations under waste storage and capacity, but it really all relates to like 590 rule regulatory implementation, which is, required ag practice 590 standards required for CSFO size and larger. And it's, farms have flexibility to change their management. It just impacts what other activities they can do to maintain compliance with 590. So it's there, but maybe we need to spell it out a little bit more specifically.
Yeah, thanks. And I think on the produce piece, and Tucker can speak to this, but I think there was a conversation around our inability to provide a replanting interval, even though the industry was hoping that we could say, you are 100% safe to replant after 30 days, which we can't do. But I think there's this piece around the risk mitigation and the risk responsibility on the produce operations, on the produce farms, on the produce farm, if they did end up having a product that wasn't contaminated with, say, heavy metals or other kind of flood residual in a subsequent planting, and there was a food illness or outbreak issue. I think there's a piece there that we probably could talk more about in this section of that's a little bit different than consumer awareness, but is really more about, like, we haven't seen that anyone has been sick from flooded fields being replanted and then some uptake into the crop. But anyway, that is a whole piece there that hasn't yet kind of come to fruition, and hopefully we won't, but I mean, it's more related to the timeline. We haven't seen it yet.
Okay.
Thank you.
Being conscious of the time, we have 5 minutes left. I just want to talk briefly about next steps, and then if we have a couple minutes, I'm happy to open it up for more questions. So we will be working on, like I said at the beginning, we will be working on putting this report together and getting a draft to you for feedback before it goes up to our chief recovery officer with the state of Vermont, and then also, eventually it'll be a public report. So look for that sometime after Thanksgiving. I would assume the first part of December. I'll definitely put out email reminders, and then after we get the feedback to get a final draft together, we will be meeting again in December. So any other next steps, Roy?
I think you covered it, but I just wanted to add this from Extension, which is a little external to this whole thing, but integral, that we're looking at ourselves in Extension and what we can do as well, because I think that Extension has a very important role to play in disaster preparedness and recovery. And so we've tried to group forward-looking preparedness actions into 2 buckets. One is things we can do better to support people and communities and to prepare themselves and to mitigate potential impacts. In other words, to build long-term resilience. And the second part is the second group is things we can do internally for clear and quick response recovery and for supporting long-term resilience and work in communities. So I'm hoping that we will, I'll get that into the conversation as well, because I think we have a definite role to play in how this all comes together. That's basically what I have as a quick summary, Nicole.
Sounds good. All right. Well, I appreciate all of your work. This was great. The report outs were great. It sounds like you all had some really productive time together in the subgroups, which I so appreciate. We have about 3 minutes left. I don't know if anybody has any other closing thoughts or questions. Otherwise, we will adjourn until December.
Nicole, you said that the process for looking at the report would be that you'll assemble something and then send it around for people to just have a look
Yes.
or provide edits or comments. Okay.
Yeah, that's our plan.
Yeah, my plan is to send the draft out to the entire group and give a deadline for feedback.
And then I think it would be great to maybe have the next, I know that Nicole, you just scheduled the task force meeting number 5 to then think about strategy for kind of seeing any of these recommendations move forward. So I think the overall message is that there's not a lot of extra money in the system of state funds this year for fiscal year 25. So, really thinking about how do we use all relationships and all partnerships as best we can to implement any of at least the short-term to mid-term priorities, since I think it would be unrealistic to assume that we're going to receive all those funds and all that support through state funding.
Agreed. I have just made note of that for the December agenda.
Great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Steve, you're on camera and not muted. So do you?
I was just ready to say thanks.
Oh, okay.
Goodbye.
All right.
All right, thanks everyone. This was really good. I appreciate the time and energy, the thoughtfulness that went into each of the the working groups and the preparation that you've done for this meeting. So thanks.
Yes, thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
See you soon.
Thanks. Abby, can I ask you one very quick